Good morning to all. I would like to welcome you all to this webinar cycle, Carbon Markets for Action and Climate Change in Latin America. Climate change is one of the biggest challenges from humanity. We all suffer their effects, but the truth is that the most vulnerable ones are the ones that are affected the most. Science has told us that the window for opportunity to face its catastrophic impacts is closing quickly. For that reason, we need to double our efforts to combat climate change because hope of a better future depends on a healthy planet. The government of the United States has taken the firm decision to be a leader in the global effort to find a solution. That's why fighting against climate change is one of the pillars of the Build Back Better or Better construct from the Biden administration. As far as we advance in this sense, from the Agency of the United States for the International Development USAID, we are proud to be with the leadership exercised by governments, rural communities, and the private sector to reduce the carbon emissions, generating opportunities that are sustainable and social development. Acknowledging that there are multiple tools to mitigate climate change, today the opportunity calls us for the carbon markets not only to reach meaningful and efficient reductions in emissions from greenhouse effects gases, but also promoting the development of local economies and communities that participate in such markets. I would like to give you an example of the achievements that carbon markets have generated in Colombia. 19 communities, Afro-descendant communities from the region of the Pacific area have seen their efforts of conservation compensated. Despite facing decades of violence and a long history of inequalities, the communities have united to avoid deforestation, protecting more than 500,000 hectares of forests. With the support from USAID, communities have generated carbon credits that's commercialized in national and international markets, thanks to the favorable regulation by the government of Colombia. Income generated because of the sale of such credits are invested in schools, health points, and community development for more than 10,000 families in one of the most vulnerable areas in the country. The objective of the webinar cycles that we launched today is precisely sharing experiences from the government, from the private sector, and communities in Latin America, and the design, implementation, and market participation at national and international level. We invite all panelists to share their learnings, their challenges and perspectives for the development of carbon markets in Latin America. We are interested in knowing your reflections on the importance that this tool has to accelerate compliance of national commitments with regards to the Paris Accord and reach other objectives for social and economic development in our region. Welcome. From the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development, we are pleased to support, along with the Agency of the United States for the International Development, USAID, this type of informative webinars that are going to let you know the generalities of the carbon market in Colombia. In the framework of urgency to combat climate change, Colombia has committed itself through its NDC to achieve a reduction of 51% of its emissions of greenhouse effect gases for 2030 within the Paris Accord. Along with our commitment with neutrality in 2050, in 2030 we will limit our emissions not to surpass a roof of 169.4 tons of carbon, equivalent to the atmosphere. This commitment is technically supported and heeds the call from science to act decisively in this direction. We also hope that we continue adding many measures, reason for which we are in an exercise of articulating actors, territories from the private sector to add increasingly more interested parties to the implementation of the ODS. To comply with this, the country has applied several measures that aim at reducing or incentivate the reduction of such emissions, in which we have the adoption of mechanisms of carbon prices, such as the tax on carbons and the emission systems challenges we have. We have included this in laws like Law 1819, which created the tax on carbon, and Law 1931, which was known as the climate change law in Colombia. We set forth the creation of the program of transactional avails of emissions and the National Plan for Development 2018-2022, an agreement for peace and equity, where we have specific aims. In these 4 years that the tax on carbon has been in place, starting in 2017, has demonstrated how important carbon markets are for transition of the country towards a carbon neutrality and compliance of our NDCs. One of the main objectives when we adopt and potentialize this type of instruments is incentive mitigation by generating a demand of reduction of greenhouse effect gases and creating an offer. At the end, what we achieve is an exchange structure in terms of mitigation of tons of CO2 equivalent, which are called carbon bonuses, and we know as the carbon market. For that reason, we would like to share national advancements and international advancements in terms of markets and challenges and opportunities that these represent for all type of public, so we may have appropriation and action. We hope to have the private sector's participation, public sector's participation, and the academia and civil society. Finally, I would like to point out that it is extremely important, it's key to appropriate and to have action. This task is not only from the national government, from different sectors, the private sector, the academia, the citizens. They can implement measures and changes in their daily activities to facilitate transition towards a low-carbon economy. An adapted country and with capacity to respond to the climate change effect is a commitment that we have in the government, and we hope all Colombians may have. Thank you very much. Good morning, but welcome. My name is Ana Milena Plata Fajardo. I am the president of Asocarbono, National Association of Carbon Market Actors. It's a pleasure to have the participation of more than 900 people connected to the first of 4 webinars that are going to be presented within the framework of cooperation between USAID, IATA, Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development, and Asocarbono. Today, we'll talk about how the private carbon market helps with the attainment of the NDCs. It's great for all involved in the sector to see how the rules in Colombia have allowed the development of a carbon market that's sufficient as an example for neighboring countries in Latin America. In these webinars, we hope to share with you the idea how certificate emissions of carbon credit promote real local changes regarding the governance, ethnic communities, reforestation, technification of infrastructure, among others. To start talking about NDC, we have 2 figures to consider. The first one has to do with the goal of diminishing 51% with the land base in 2030. The second one is the goal of decreasing deforestation rate to 50,000 hectares per year. Let's remember that the deforestation rate today is approximately 60,000 hectares per year. So we have a key role in ethnic communities here. They have more relevance in Colombia. Today, 32% of forest lands belong to African Americans and indigenous lands. To complement the figures, I would like to point out that Apart from the 19 Afro-Colombian communities and Indian territories located in 500,000 hectares, in Colombia we have over 30 Afro-Colombian communities and indigenous communities supported by private direct investment. As a Carbono, we think that thanks to the financing by the USAID and private investors, we protect nearly 4 million hectares of forests in the country. This figure is not only the equivalent to deforestation and degradation, it also represents a source of financing for in terms of climate. I would like to point out now the climate financing. Since right now, Colombia is facing a third peak on the pandemics, and we have a greater difficulty in the creation of new sources of employment and economic solvency. That's why regulation and not causation of tax carbon, but also due to the increase of demand of voluntary compensation, leverages the development of forest regions of the deep Colombia and also leverages technological inventions of non-conventional technology. I feel that all of us who participate here are aware of this. I'm glad that from here to 10 years, from 10 years from now, carbon market is going to be one of the best stories to tell in the post-pandemic era. It's a great opportunity so that companies and citizens who have not yet done the compensation they may join the market so that they can help protect the tropical forest and other critical ecosystems, improve the means of life of most vulnerable people, and accelerate the implementation of new technologies. Thank you very much.
My name is Dirk Forrester, and I'm pleased to be with you. I'm joining you from the States, and it's great to see such a large group of interest in future of carbon market. For IETA, Latin America holds a lot of promise because we see a rise in interest in use of carbon pricing systems. And we know that in order to reach the levels inspired by the Paris Climate Agreement of reducing emissions to net zero level that preserve the global warming of our planet to no more than 2 degrees and hopefully only 1.5 degrees, that level of action is going to require a level of cooperation and investment that we've never seen before. We've looked at a lot of economic analysis about pathways for achieving net zero emissions. And one of the lessons we've learned is that there are 3 essential elements for getting there. One is that the private sector and the public sector need to come together around solutions that can really inspire business to innovate and to invest at scale. That requires carbon pricing, and AIDA is a proud member of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition that the World Bank has helped to organize, and we collaborate with a number of governments, including the government of Colombia in the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. The second piece that's really essential is to understand that ultimately emissions are going to have to come down to a level of net zero, not zero, but net zero. And what the net means is that any remaining emissions are going to be compensated with the same amount of removals. Removals of carbon from the atmosphere can take place in a number of ways through improved agricultural practices, as is being explored in Colombia, through improved forestry projects, which we'll be talking about today, or improved forest management and reforestation, which can pull more carbon out of the air and store it in our forests. And of course, technological opportunities as well for using engineered solutions that can do what a tree does of sucking carbon out of the air and storing it permanently. So removals are going to play an important role in the future. And then finally, cooperation through markets that can cross international borders. We think that's going to be essential for us as humanity achieving net zero emissions. That means that the pioneering efforts that Colombia has underway could be workable for other countries, but could also lay a pathway for cooperation across borders where emission removals could be brought to market on a global basis and attract investment into good removal practices. This ability to connect markets internationally is one of our highest priorities in IETA, because we're serious about getting to net zero emissions. And to get to net zero, you have to have markets that connect across borders. This is an important topic in this year because international negotiators are working on the rules for accounting for cooperation for transfers of units across borders. This is the work of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And our hope is that Colombia can join with other leaders across Latin America to help us get good rules agreed this year so that more market connections can happen in the future. There's nothing stopping countries across the region from going forward with their own cooperative approaches, either domestically or internationally. It's been encouraging to see Peru enter an agreement with Switzerland that lays out a pathway for cooperation between those two countries. But that's just the tip of the iceberg on what the potential is, because as I said, we need to scale up the amount of investment, and that's going to require good market incentives, good pricing signals, and international market cooperation that recognizes the role of natural climate solutions. It's a delight for IETA to collaborate with our friends at Aso Carbono. So thanks, Ana Milena, for being here. Also with our friends at USAID. And I hope that all of you will get a lot out of this workshop today. And thank you for attending. Muchas gracias.
Good morning, everyone. And I just want to start by saying how excited I am to be on the line this morning at this important webinar with scientists, policymakers, economists, activists, private sector leaders. It really is great to be here. And I want to thank you all for the opportunity to open this strategic set of webinars on the growing use of carbon markets and carbon pricing in Latin American countries. I want to greet and thank the organizers at the International Emissions Trading Association, IETA. I want to greet Colombia's Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development, of course, the Colombian Association of Carbon Market Actors, Aso Carbono, our teams at USAID, what we call DDI, and certainly our Colombia mission. Great to see Martha Ponte on the line this morning. Thank you so much for organizing this very timely event. This set of 4 webinars will build on the momentum of President Biden's climate summit last week and will lead a robust public-private discussion to help map out the road to COP26 at Glasgow in November. At USAID, we know that we really don't have a minute to waste. And there really are no more important and no more empowered audiences than the private and public sector leaders that we've invited to these webinars. At USAID, we also believe in the power of markets and the importance of engaging the private sector as key development partners in everything we do, including tackling the climate crisis. This is why we've supported market-based alternatives, such as our BioRed projects in Colombia's magnificent Pacific forests, which have slowed deforestation by thousands of hectares per year. And it is in recognition of the power of the market to drive change that we've supported the implementation of Colombia's carbon tax and helped to design the regulatory structure of that country's domestic carbon market. We salute Colombia's leadership today. We need to harness the power of the private sector in partnership with governments and civil society to achieve meaningful progress in the climate crisis, what is arguably the most pressing global challenge of our times. The US government joined the road back to progress when President Biden recommitted the United States to the Paris Climate Accord on the first day of his administration. In just a few short months, the US has taken decisive action. President Biden named John Kerry as special climate envoy, and he convened 40 heads of state, representatives of the indigenous communities, youth leaders, and the private sector at the Climate Summit on the 22nd of April, the largest virtual meeting of its kind the world has seen, demonstrating the central importance of the climate crisis to both our domestic and foreign policy agendas. It was a motivating event and truly heartening to hear the strong supporting positions from leaders from around the globe and across the Latin America and Caribbean region, including the presidents of Jamaica, Colombia, Chile, and Brazil. But going forward, it's important to the United States and for countries and private sector companies all over the world to travel down that road with humility, commitment, and greater ambition. Humility also in knowing that for all our industrial capacity, the United States is responsible for only 15% of global emissions. The whole world really must come together to solve this problem. No one country can do it alone. And humility in knowing that today, no country and no continent is getting the job done. Not yet. At the COP in November, all nations must raise ambition together, or we'll all fail together. Failure, however, as we know, is not an option. As climate envoy Kerry has often stated, success means tapping into the best of our collective ingenuity, creativity, and diplomacy, from brain power to alternative energy power, using every tool we have to get where we need to go. Success means lifting up communities long left behind and creating an equitable recovery. Success means ensuring economic efficiency in our mitigation programs, and it means leading our key sectors in the process. The road ahead's challenging, but it's also an exciting prospect as we green and transform our economies. It means creating millions of middle-class jobs. It means less pollution in our air and in our oceans. It means making life healthier for citizens across the world. It means the creation of new markets, such as the markets for cost-effective mitigation services. Technological innovation is now in our favor, but the governments, policymakers, financial entities, and private sector producers can and must be in the lead if we're to stave off the worst impacts of climate change. For all of us working on the climate front, it's clear that cleaning up greenhouse gas emissions from our economic production can be a win-win proposition. Just a few examples to make this point. Globally, the cheapest new electric power plant one can install is based on renewables, which explains why it now makes up more than 70% of new capacity. South America, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, and Brazil are moving quickly to transform their energy sectors with massive private sector investments in solar and wind generation projects. The highest valued auto company in the world today only makes electric zero emission vehicles. We see Latin America's clean energy systems positioned to lead the world in the transition to electric mobility with major reductions in CO2 emissions. Carbon pricing and markets can lead new investments toward clean technologies, such as the zero emissions steel plant that is now being built in Austria, where emissions are subject to cap and trade carbon markets. We are seeing carbon capture and storage becoming more cost effective, and with carbon pricing in its favor, it can now become a reality sooner. For example, a cement plant in Norway that anticipates capturing and storing all its CO2 by 2030. And green economies will generate new jobs. The European Union anticipates 2 million additional jobs with the green economy growing under its carbon market, the EU emission trading system. Here in the US, prior to the outset and disruption of the COVID-19 pandemic, we experienced 5 years of steady growth in clean energy employment, with over 3.3 million new workers put into jobs across our country. In India, the country has seen a 5-fold increase in clean energy jobs over the same period, demonstrating the opportunities that green growth can create. But we need to all move together. We need to collectively focus on the steep reductions needed to meet the goal of limiting temperature change to 1.5 degrees in order to avert catastrophic damage. Well-designed and organized carbon markets offer huge opportunities for businesses, industrialists, energy producers, farmers, and forestry specialists to create clean green jobs and economic growth, and to use President Biden's words, to accelerate green investment and to lower our emissions trajectories. We know we need to phase out coal 5 times faster than we have been. We need to increase tree cover 5 times faster. We need to ramp up renewable energy 6 times faster. We need to transition to electric vehicles at a rate 22 times faster. And we need to bring tropical deforestation to a halt by 2030. Carbon pricing and carbon markets can help us do that. Reaching net zero global carbon emissions as early as possible will take a wholesale transformation of the global economy. At the climate summit, many presidents indicated the need to shift this goal from 2050 to 2030. And the success of that transformation will depend in large part on efficient pricing of carbon emissions and on the structuring and functioning of efficient markets. Efficient markets make clean production more profitable and make emission-intensive production less competitive. But we need leadership from public policymakers and the private sector alike. The good news, it's the economic opportunity of many lifetimes. We're looking at an unprecedented wealth creation opportunity. Since 2015, when the Paris Climate Agreement was signed, solar and wind power have doubled their share of global electricity to 10%. In most countries in the world, renewable energy is now cheaper than fossil-fueled power plants. Global investment in new clean power capacity is set to exceed $10 trillion through mid-century, more than 6 times the investment in dirtier options. Other clean energy sectors, from greenhouse hydrogen to electric vehicles, could also represent multi-trillion-dollar markets in the decades to come. Here's the challenge. Clean energy gets cheaper, but a net zero transition will become more complex, requiring greater leadership everywhere. It won't be enough to merely keep deploying more clean energy. Major economies around the world will need to design and execute tailored roadmaps to overhaul their own energy systems. For the market-based economies of the Americas, the introduction of carbon pricing and efficient carbon markets are needed to provide clear price signals to project developers, investors, and the economic systems at large. As our host, the International Emissions Trading Association, has shown us over the years, we'll need to collaborate on carbon pricing in emissions-intensive sectors that cross borders, aviation, shipping, heavy industry, power, and more, to chart a path to deep decarbonization in each. Governments have an important role to play in galvanizing net zero transitions, and carbon markets can be a significant element of the policy toolkit. Markets can lead investment in developing countries by identifying the least cost paths to compliance and mitigation towards the cleaner technologies, and markets can reward innovators. Carbon market design and development allows governments to partner intimately with the private sector, which brings expertise in every corner of the economy, substantial capacity to invest in new infrastructure, and the ingenuity and drive to bring new innovations to market. The Biden administration is optimistic that we can get there. Sustainable investment funds surpassed $1 trillion for the first time on record. And the boom in environmental, social, and corporate governance investing is only beginning as fund inflows quadrupled in 2020. Venture capital investments in innovative technologies to combat climate change also surged to a record high in 2020. These are positive trends, but challenges remain. In order to transition to a clean energy economy and to do so rapidly, we need to develop and scale new and improved technologies. Even though a handful of clean energy technologies such as solar and wind power are now cost competitive with fossil fuels, most aren't. The International Energy Agency warns that 42 of 46 critical clean energy technologies aren't yet on track, and roughly half of the carbon emissions reductions needed for a swift net zero transition will need to come from energy technologies that have not even reached commercial markets yet. This means we have a big job ahead of us, and we must spur even greater innovation. Appropriate price signals can help us in this regard and can be instrumental in driving innovation. The good news is we're seeing growing interest in price mechanisms, as this program of webinars will demonstrate. We can solve this challenge as we have so many others by working together through effective policy planning, efficient regulation, and the appropriate use of markets to guide investment towards low emissions alternatives in the productive sphere. Across energy storage, advanced mobility, next generation renewable and other clean power technologies, clean industrial processes, zero carbon fuels, smart systems, carbon capture, and more, we stand at the precipice of a rare opportunity to create new technologies and new markets. The countries that make it a strategic priority to foster these markets and industries will not only help reduce emissions both within and outside their borders, they'll also reap the economic rewards of powering the global economic transformation. In Colombia, as has been noted, USAID is supporting the government, the private sector, and communities to consolidate its market for domestic carbon credits. Since the adoption of a favorable regulation in 2016, the Colombia carbon market has traded more than 36 million tons of carbon, which provide finance for clean energy and to fight deforestation. Colombia is a forest country, so it's no surprise that most of those carbon credits correspond to the efforts of rural communities, Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities, to protect their forests and adopt sustainable livelihoods, also helping the fight against illicit activities. The Colombian carbon market is fostering the participation and innovation from the private actors in other sectors such as energy and industry, accelerating the energy transformation that country is addressing. It is progressing in its quest to establish a complementary cap and trade system. The Colombian experience can be of great use in other Latin American countries, eager to accelerate the implementation of their climate goals and to green their economies. In the United States, to compensate for the lack of national carbon dioxide regulation, a dozen states have initiated their own regulations, alone or in conjunction with others. In January 2013, California officially launched its comprehensive cap and trade program, while 9 states in the Northeast region of the US continue to participate in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, a carbon trading program aimed at the power sector. The Canadian province of Quebec joined forces with California to form a cross-border market in January 2014, while Alberta continues to press forward with its carbon reduction program, and British Columbia remains committed to its pioneering carbon tax and carbon neutral government program. Pacific Coast neighbors, British Columbia, California, Oregon, and Washington have also joined forces to take on the challenge of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the region, with Oregon and Washington possibly adopting a price on carbon pollution as part of this initiative, known as the Pacific Coast Collaborative. We at USAID are firmly committed to mitigating climate change. We hope that this set of 4 webinars can encourage a robust discussion on the role of carbon markets and how each nation can appropriately design carbon pricing and carbon markets throughout the hemisphere. You can be assured that the new administration is firmly committed to leading and supporting on this front. So now, with humility and ambition, let's get to work to make it a reality on the road to Glasgow and on the road to net zero, the road to defeating the climate crisis and leaving our kids a world that is prosperous, healthy, and secure. Thank you.
have a good day. Really, I celebrate this series of webinars that is going to allow us to, in Latin America, to strengthen capacities to know other experiences, especially because in countries in Latin America who have already delivered their updating of the commitments at national level, all of them have included the transition axis in terms of energetic proposals. What we have heard so far from our panelists here, what we're going to get to know in this panel, it's going to be of great use. For example, in the case of Panama, the most of emissions we have them precisely in the energetic sector, but especially in transportation. We have very ambitious commitments in the energetic transitions to reduce 24% of emissions. But Panama is characterized also because it's negative, carbon negative. But we have evidence in the second biennial report that we delivered in February. Our greatest concern is that precisely we have a great coverage of forests, but we still have capacity to restore degraded lands and increase forest coverage. We're working on the global capture of 38% emissions. We could contribute even more, but even so, we have set as a goal to reduce emissions not only in energetic transitions, but also in the commitment from the agro-industry sector. We've launched recently the program Reduce Your Footprint, carbon print. It's the first step for the design of our carbon market. We already worked in that with the support from the World Bank. We are in the reduction of emissions at corporate level, designing the compensation systems to later on set for the transaction system. We hope that the Panamanian market is officially operating in the stock market in Panama next year. So this experience for us is extremely important, and what we'll get to know from the presentations from our panelists is going to be of great use, as I told you, for our country and for the rest of the countries here. In that great coverage of forests we also have a lot of poverty, characterized by a very high inequity of those who live within our forests and around our forests. The market coverage is a great opportunity that allows us to improve living conditions and have a social function by performing green economy at local level. This green economy is going to impact the macroeconomics and is going to allow us to improve our development. So it could be a sustainable development, inclusive, low in emissions, and resilient to climate change. We have three excellent panelists today. I'm going to give the word now to the opportunity to present Mariano Morausano. He is precisely the chief of energetic transitional policies for the region of Latin America. Mariano, the floor is yours. Hello, thank you, Ligia. Good morning to all participants. Before anything else, I would like to thank USAID and the Ministry of Environment for the invitation on a topic that it's a passion for me. I've worked with this in the Italian government, working with IETA and in Latin American countries to implement price systems. Thank you very much. We could continue now with the next slide, please. So quickly, this is just to remind you that the Group N is an NL. It's an electric power generation company in Italy. So we have assets in renewable energy and intelligent networks, and more than 74 million users. With this, we confirm that we're working in the energetic transitions and working with the climate change. We also talked about the objective of NDCs, we are committed to respect those objectives and contribute to their achievement. We work in 4 of them, 7 and 3rd, clean energy and climate change, and also the objectives set forth according to science-based targets initiatives. We have a commitment for 2050. Next slide, please. Next. Prior to talking about the carbon industry, I would like to talk about, like the previous speakers, this is a topic that how to achieve the objectives of the Paris Accord in our case. And remember that in these 4 segments of the business, we have these 4 directions. We work in renewable energies, the flow of renewables. Talked about in electric mobility and urban infrastructure. The whole business is aligned with the Paris Accord. Next slide. We can also see that not only do we comply with our business, we try to contribute to the objectives. We also cooperate with other governments to achieve those objectives. We're working with this call to accelerate the energetic transition, taking advantage of transparent regulatory frameworks, and in the carbon market. We cooperate, creating scenarios and interested parties. Here we have a report with the project we developed with Colombia, 2019 with the Andes University, and from the support from the government. Next slide. Okay. Here we always enjoy and exploit, and we value the use of carbon. But it's more important than ever if we continue using it. It's not our opinion. I simplify here. While we see the trends or drivers are pushing countries towards the use of carbon, but contributing to the implementation of NDC, so transition could be more cost efficient, and also energetic market or fiscal reforms that are also aligned with the NDCs, and they require the mechanisms of carbon market for an energetic, efficient market. And finally, this is most important also, we have financial operators at national and international level that also ask for the implementation of the price of carbon in companies and markets to reduce the investment risks in the activities in the countries. Next slide. Here, just to remind you, 2 points, the international context. Here we have a lot of agents. We have the World Bank, we have International Monetary Fund, and the OCDE, and we have some simple elements, obviously having a long-term vision, especially to implement the carbon market and have a fixed price to accompany it, based on the connection in each country. And also bear in mind possible impacts of carbon prices to complement one of the effects. Here I am just showing the price of LTS in Europe to show a long-term experience. They're undergoing difficult times, but we've worked, and we're also working to implement the system to improve it. We could see the results. Price has risen, and apparently it works perfectly. It has also been used, and they're going to be used again. We're going to have other flexibility tools like carbon offsets. This is just to remind you that in Latin America we have a similar situation. This is not our opinion, but governments in Latin America are committing themselves through a Pacific Alliance, for example. You can see here, to reduce carbon emissions. They are all aligned to be integrated in the future. Next. This is just to remind you that we also support ourselves in a project as international consultants called Perspective Climate Group to talk about the commerce system in Latin America. We work with Chile, Peru, and Colombia to see how these instruments, ETS, they could contribute to the reduction in these countries and facilitate the implementation nationally and regionally, also aligning this to the Article 6 of the Paris Accord. We could have a global international market. This project, we had several results. I summarize because of time. It's very important is that clearly we have some tools as a carbon tax that is being applied today, the offset, and we could implement a transaction system like emission trading. But it's important to bear in mind that each country is different. We have to consider each characteristic of each country. And then obviously it is very important to implement articles like they have markets that work and function internationally, and obviously see that the economic efficiency in these markets improve. Colombia, we know they have a very important legal framework. Chile and Peru are working similarly, so it has the Colombian experience has been very useful. And remind you that the commerce of emissions to be implemented has to be should be big enough to draw national systems that are at the local level, but aligned and compatible with the future integration at international level. And remember the role of the carbon offset, which is a tool that's already being used in Latin America with the clean development mechanism and also working the volunteer development. And that's how we're building a more efficient market. Finally, obviously, this mechanism help flexibilize the carbon market and the more efficient markets. And with this, next slide, please. I'll leave here I'll give the floor back to our moderator. Shall there be any questions? Thank you. Thank you very much. Now we're going to go with Claudia, and at the end, we're going to make the questions. Thank you very much for such a good presentation. Now we're going to go with Claudia Schaefer, the Global Director of Energy and Climate from Dow Chemical. Thank you very much. Can you listen to me? To see if I have a good signal. Okay. Good morning to all of you.
In English, my Spanish, when I talk about climate, is not the best language. It's a pleasure to join you today. Very good comments about what's needed for decarbonization. Very glad to see all those parties together because really collaboration is the path to go. So I would like to start introducing Dow. Maybe not all of you know who we are. Dow is a material science company, and we produce solutions which address many types of climate change and other challenges in the packaging, infrastructure, and also consumer goods. And some examples are, for example, fluids and materials used in solar power generation. We also produce sealants and insulation materials that help in energy efficiency in building and construction, lightweight materials, and others. So let me start. The next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, I would like to share with you our plans and a recent announcement we made last year on sustainability goals, in addition to our 2025 sustainability program. And we basically, we reinforced our commitment with climate protection, with stop the waste and close the loop. In climate protection, we committed to reduce emissions by 5 million tons by 2030. And this is quite challenging because we are a hard to decarbonize industry. And we also committed with carbon neutrality by 2050. So next slide, to share with you our path to decarbonization. Next slide. Okay, so how do we achieve that? And we have been hearing how difficult it is, and that we need new technologies, we need innovation. So we start with continued optimization of our processes. We have been doing that for the past 30 years, but there are always other things we can do. We are increasing our renewable use, and whenever it's cost competitive. And Dow is today the largest chemical company globally in renewable power purchase. But we really, long-term, to really decarbonize, we'll need to invest in step change technologies. This will take time. We have today a JV, this is one example, we have many others, but we have a JV with Shell where we are developing electrified cracking, which is a possible route for decarbonization in our industry. We have also other catalytic processes being developed, which would decrease significantly energy use. But we will need mitigation and transitioning technologies, as we've heard, removals. Carbon capture and storage is an area we are looking at, and blue hydrogen. And we have currently collaboration in a coalition in the Netherlands with other industries, with governments, to really understand our options and how we scale up infrastructure and go implement CCS and carbon capture in this area. And another also very important piece is our continuous investment in innovation, because the chemical industry contributes with materials which are critical in this process. So we want to continue to invest there and help decarbonize our value chains. So next slide, please. And the path ahead is basically what we've heard here, right? We know that we will need a lot of investments, we need innovation, and we cannot make it alone. So it's really everything we've heard here. It's public-private partnerships. It's good regulation, stable, the right pricing signals, so we can really advance towards that, because it's also about affordability, risk reward, so we can attract the investments. Because we as companies, we need also to deliver returns to our investors. So we need to find a way to do this. And we also need that society recognizes that this transitioning has a cost, right? We all need to be part of this transitioning, really, to make it happen. So I would like then now to talk about Latin America, because that's the focus today. We have been present in Latin America for the past 60 years. We have 14 manufacturing sites, and we have offices in Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, and Argentina. And we believe that Latin America has great advantages in the low carbon economy because of the abundant and cost competitive natural resources. So we have good projects and programs which can help economies, can help communities, and also for us can help our positioning in low carbon operations and low carbon products. So let me share with you two examples of what we are doing. So next slide, please. So the first example is a solar power deal we closed for our Aratu site. This is in Brazil. And this site already consumes 75% of renewable power and energy. We have also biomass steam. And with this solar deal, we become 100% renewable power. And I think here the major message is that we have other stacks beyond carbon when we do renewable power. In this case, we are also helping with job generation and gender inclusion beyond the climate benefits. So next slide, please. The second example is related to supply chain engagement with best practices and forest preservation in another site in Brazil, in Rio Branco. And this is, so it's really when you are in a forestry chain, it's very important that you are responsible and that you drive the right regulatory behavior through contracts that reinforce the commitment of our suppliers and contractors. 100% of our charcoal are from FSC certified forests, and this is aligned with the best international standards. And also, we own 40% of the native forests in Rio Branco, and we take it very seriously to preserve it. And this contributes with biodiversity conservation besides carbon storage. So in summary, that's what I wanted to share with you. I wanted to emphasize that we do believe that decarbonization is the path to go. It's possible with collaboration. It's very challenging as well, but it's doable. We need the right instruments in place, which is the collaboration, carbon pricing, climate policies that do not contribute to generating confusions between implicit and explicit carbon pricing, because this ends up driving instability in the view of which is going to be your future carbon pricing. And we do believe that Latin America is really very well positioned for a low carbon economy, contributing with economies, with the communities, and also with the environment. So thank you very much for your attention, and back to you, Ligia.
Thank you very much. Your presentation was very good and useful for our countries in Latin America. And now we're going to introduce you Michael Cortez. He's the president of Wildlife. Welcome. Welcome. Please, the floor is yours, sir.
Good morning, Ligia and everybody. I am Mike Korchinski, the president of Wildlife Works. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you, USAID, for organizing this event. And if you could put my presentation up, I'm seeing here we go. Thank you very much. My slides are in Spanish in case anybody wants to read along, but I will be speaking in English today. So you can move to the next slide, please. So just a brief introduction of who Wildlife Works is. We're a global leader in conservation. We are unique in the sense that all of our conservation activity worldwide is funded through market activity, and in particular, the REDD+ market. So we are effectively a global specialist in how to implement REDD+ to stop deforestation. So that's all we do as a company in all the countries in which we work. We came to Colombia. I should say we've been around for about 24 years. So we've been doing this for 24 years around the world, started in Africa. We came to Colombia in 2018 as the private sector partner to implement the BioRED program that you've heard about, that USAID brought to Colombia with Minambiente, the Ministry of Environment in Colombia. And we've been working with 8 communities in both Afro-Colombian communities and indigenous community in the Pacific region of Colombia for the last 3 years, as helping them to implement this transition to forest protection model versus a forest exploitation model. And we are about to invest, or we are in the middle of investing about $5 million US in new projects. That is all private sector funding from the US in new Colombian projects. And that is as a result of these initiatives that you've heard of, that the Colombian government has taken over the past 5 years in creating the best framework, frankly, in the world for REDD+ regulation. And so that's attracted investment to develop more projects. It could attract still much more investment in the future. Globally, as a company, we are managing over $1 billion in private sector financing flowing into REDD projects around the world. Next slide, please. So I think we all understand the need. Many people have spoken of the urgent need for reductions in emissions, and have spoken about how that urgent need creates a great opportunity. And I think the same is true in the forest sector and in conservation, which is where we operate. So we all agree on the goal. The goal is to broadly achieve the NDC commitments of Latin American countries through, in our case, reducing dramatically the rates of deforestation. We strongly believe we won't achieve carbon neutrality in the agricultural and forestry sector without stopping deforestation. We can't reforest our way out of this problem if we can't stop deforestation. So our focus is entirely on stopping deforestation, working with communities. But the other goal we hope to achieve is a dramatic impact on the SDGs, or ODS as they are in Spanish. And what that means really should mean a reduction, a dramatic reduction in loss of biodiversity. As you protect the forest and the habitat, you protect the species that live there. And also a dramatic improvement in livelihoods for forest communities. When we talk about the global challenge to reduce emissions by stopping deforestation, we need to remember there are billions of people living in forests around the world. And those people need to find new ways of living in order to protect the forests that they call home. But overall, the goal, we believe, is to reduce at least 2 billion tons of emissions from deforestation. Now, that if we can do that, and if the market can support that, then we feel that there's an opportunity to achieve the broader goals that we've discussed. Next slide, please. So we all agree on the goal, but we don't all agree on the path. And this is one of my key messages, is all paths lead to the same goal. All paths that aim for the same goal should be followed at this point. We don't have time to compete for paths to the goal. And so just as an example of that, in our sphere of operation in the area of REDD+, many people are in discussions all over the world about the evolution of REDD+ towards national and subnational programs, and away from project activities such as the ones that are have been described under the BioRED program in USAID. And so people talk about these things as alternatives, and they each have their strengths and weaknesses, it's true. So national programs and subnational programs, which clearly are the goal to support those national programs through success, they are very good at policy and enforcement. They're not so good at localizing initiative and incentive for individual communities and forest communities. Projects have the opposite strengths and weaknesses. Projects are not so good at policy and enforcement, shouldn't be their job, should be the government's job, but they're very good at localizing incentive and working specifically with local drivers of deforestation to aid communities in that transition process. So while some people see this as alternatives, next slide, please. At Wildlife Works, we really see these as complementary activities, that the right solution, we believe, for national governments is a solution that combines the strengths of both approaches to mitigate the weaknesses of both. You may notice it's no accident that the strengths of one approach are the weaknesses of the other approach. And we feel strongly that governments that can find a way to combine those two approaches, the strengths of government programs and policy, and the strengths of private sector localized initiatives and incentives, will be the ones that succeed in reducing deforestation most successfully. So that's an example of where there's discussion about paths that we think is counterproductive, that we feel that it should be a complementary set of solutions rather than an alternative set. Another example of that would be this question of removals versus offsets. So the notion here is that, for those that aren't so familiar, the discussion about removals is growing new trees to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere, versus protecting existing trees, avoiding the deforestation of existing trees. Again, we don't think that should be an either or. Both are essential for us to achieve the target. We need to invest in stopping deforestation, and we need to invest in reforestation activities. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that illustrates just one detail that we think that countries need to think about as they move forward in order to be able to take advantage of this complementary solution. And this graph is maybe familiar to some on this presentation. It's a graph produced by the government of Colombia in their submission under the UNFCCC for their forest reference level. So the black line is the historical emissions associated with deforestation. It's actually a deforestation graph. And then the purple line and the area under is the government's view of what would happen without the right level of financial investment and support in stopping deforestation. So that's their projection of what would happen into the future. The idea here is that the market can support the achievement of reductions of those of that deforestation. But importantly, there are two kinds of market that are out there. There's a voluntary market, which is made up of all those companies that are not regulated for their carbon emissions. And those companies that just want to do the right thing by contributing to climate mitigation globally. And then there's the compliance markets or the regulatory markets, which require reductions by companies and which will allow, in some cases, companies to mitigate their obligation by offsetting the carbon footprint with credits from the market. So those two markets act differently, and they set targets differently in some cases. So that dotted line that you see running across the middle there, horizontally, represents the historical average of Colombia's emissions. So it represents an average. And in the voluntary market, the opportunity is to finance the reductions from where Colombia is now and where it's going down to that average and beyond. Whereas in some of the compliance markets, they won't begin financing performance until the performance has reached that historical average. So again, this illustrates why these cannot be contradictory approaches. They need to be complementary approaches so that governments have the full range of financing options and the full range of market options to allow them to achieve that success. And if that isn't the case, so if you could go to the next slide, please. So there is one particular standard out there that's available to countries that it sets up this conflict because it requires that any performance that is supported from in the green arrow there, you can see from the current level of emissions of a country down to their average, if the market is used to finance that performance, then that performance has to be deducted from the average target before any reward can be made under the jurisdictional program. So that sets up an either-or choice for governments, which we feel is an unnecessary choice and an unhelpful choice for most governments. Most governments, I say, especially where there's a rising emission profile historically, which sadly is still the case for many tropical forest countries and certainly the large forest countries. So this environment requires some knowledge, some expertise to navigate, but importantly, the goal, in our opinion, should be to achieve this level of reduction supported by the market, both voluntary and compliance, because we believe the voluntary market will remain very healthy and is growing very quickly. But the second most important thing about this combination of national program and projects is, the next slide, please. Could you move to the next slide? Is the importance for communities, for indigenous communities, for communities of African descent, and for local communities who live in the forests, because the projects allow them to be incentivized to protect their forest. And it doesn't require them to be rewarded. It doesn't hold their rewards until the whole country performs. So it allows for incremental success, community after community after community, towards the national goal. The other approach, the either-or approach, requires a national goal to be achieved before anybody can be rewarded for their performance. And that, in our opinion, is not the right model. Now, Colombia, in their leadership, has the best legislation in the world, the best framework in the world to support this combined effort of projects working in harmony with programs. So there is an example, a real one right here in Colombia, of the framework that you need to be able to reward communities for their own performance, independently of the performance of the state as a whole, but build towards that performance as a state and be rewarded at the national level when you achieve that performance. So, and Indigenous communities need their own projects because they're the best to decide on which SDGs are important for them, which ODS or which SDGs are important for them. They know from their livelihood plans what they need. And it's not the same from community to community. And so that kind of specific support for communities is best done, in our opinion, through local action and local incentive. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your time.
Michael, excellent. We've had three excellent presentations that complement each other among themselves. I hope all of participants have really enjoyed it as much as I did. So I'm going to make the first question. I'm going to ask in the same order that they were presented to please answer them. Which are the opportunities and challenges for the use of offset in the energetic sector in the region in Latin America?
Hola, gracias por la pregunta.
The first challenge for us to use the offset is to have legal framework stability to set the objectives and clear pathways from the government and a certain clarity. And in terms of the tools that are going to be used, tax carbon and the offsets, somehow this is what's being planned now. But for us, we have to program investment for decades. We need to understand which the tools and instruments are going to be, and the sequence and idea of the mission. So to organize our investments with the opportunities that the regulatory framework may create. This is the challenge. The opportunity for us is to have, for us, the system will have transactional costs that it's lower somehow. So that's decided by the government in the energetic policies. You could use offsets to reach the objectives with the best cost possible, and also bring benefits for consumers or the forestry sector or communities, depending on the offsets we are aiming for. Thank you very much. Now, Claudia.
I think offsets, as we heard in the beginning of this presentation, they will be needed, right, in net zero strategies, because it doesn't mean that we'll be able to deliver zero emissions. So it's going to be needed. I think in the region, we have very good opportunities for nature-based solutions offsets, which are needed and tend to be cost competitive compared to others. So that's something we are always looking at. The challenge is that the greenhouse gas protocol doesn't recognize offsets for emissions reduction. So there's lots of uncertainties in that area. They do recognize when these offsets are part, you can use that, but when it's out of your value chain is not. I think offsets market, the voluntary market, it's still very uncertain. We don't know how the Article 6 will evolve, and we don't know how much this will cost. Those are not fluid markets. So lots of uncertainties on how everything will evolve. And I think REDD+, for example, it's also lots of questions about how credible they are, right, Mike? That's your area, you know that much more than we do, but there are always lots of questions about the credibility, the permanency, and the leakage, lots of questions about that. So we need to organize ourselves better. We need to have clear frameworks and clear regulatory view. Today is a patchwork. We don't know how things will evolve. And this doesn't help attract investments as we would need.
Gracias, Michael.
Okay. Well, as we live in that world of uncertainty, and we have done for 20 years. And what I would say is that the some of that uncertainty is real, historically for sure. What we're seeing now is that many of the arguments that people use to claim uncertainty or to suggest that there's issues with Red Plus are very old arguments, and many of those problems were solved through the best practice of standards years ago. So the leading standards today solve the issues of permanence and leakage very well as any other sector. And so those are historical arguments that aren't relevant today. What we see today is that the voluntary market, while it was slow to develop in the beginning, when companies were not required to mitigate their footprints, then why would they? And no company was required when compliance markets didn't exist. But now what we see is, now that the marketplace is waking up to the urgency of climate change for their own business, there's honestly a tsunami of interest from the private sector in Red Plus. We haven't seen anything like this in 20 years of the interest in supporting Red Plus. And why it makes sense for corporates to support Red Plus is the SDG impact, the ODS impact that comes along with it. Corporates want to tell good stories about the way that they are helping to mitigate climate change. And yes, of course, they have to reduce all the emissions they can reduce first, no question. But almost every company will still have unavoidable emissions. So the question is, what do they do with those unavoidable emissions? Do they ignore them, or do they compensate them by supporting avoided deforestation or other projects that generate offsets? And this term offset is used often as some hypothetical thing, but in the forestry sector, an offset is one very rigorously scientifically proven ton of reductions from stopping deforestation. So we should remember that. And the other thing that the corporates like is the communities. They love to be able to point to a place on Earth where they're helping to support a community through this transition and helping to support biodiversity in a very specific place. So I think offsets have a long future. We're seeing an enormous growth in interest. And really, frankly, the supply is the challenge now. How do we ramp up the investment in protecting forests globally?
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. I totally agree. I think that, yes, it's a very good moment. Precisely because we are trying to, so that we could also close the negotiation of Article 6 within the framework of the Paris Accord, so we could strengthen the prices on carbon and the market. But countries are working so that we could achieve this agreement and close Article 6 simultaneously. We are preparing ourselves in policies and standards for a voluntary market that can also be performed in our country. So we're working simultaneously here. The second question would be ask you is, which are the learned lessons from the United States that should be taken into account in Latin America to advance in carbon price mechanisms? Well, hello, thank you, Ligia. I'm going to talk about the European experiences as I worked as an Italian and an Italo-Argentinian that I am, and I've been participating in the market in the construction of a European system of transaxable new emissions scheme. Simplifying this, I would say that is important lessons. The first one is that the system in Europe has been planned with a long-term vision. So it's going to exist for long, but it's been done gradually, step by step, with a pilot stage, softer stage with lesser costs for companies. And we have several stages improving and correcting the system. So that planning of long-term and market safety, it's very important. The second lesson is it's to have the interaction between the carbon market with other policies in Europe. This has happened At the beginning, we have the electric generation power market, we have renewable, we have gas, and other efficiency measures interaction with the market. So it's calculated. We need to calculate impacts on industries or users of energy. So all these impacts and interactions are considered. And the last one that's extremely important in the initial stage, communication is key. And to have both with the private sector and public sector, it's important to work with the private sector to better understand the implementation of the system with demands and challenges. These are the three key points that I would put on the table. Thank you. Thank you very much, Claudia.
In the US, is everything still in an early stage, right? I think now with the Biden government, we need to see how things will evolve. I think in that area, there are indications that they will start with policies that are that will bring implicit carbon pricing, but not explicit carbon pricing, at least in the beginning. So I think there, what we need is the stability again. And then we need bipartisan agreements, because that will drive some stability on commitments that will be brought forward. So we are watching that, and everybody's learning. We don't know exactly how everything will evolve. And in Europe, where this emissions trade scheme is in place for a long time, I think it's pretty much aligned with Mariano said. There are good learnings on the stability. It started with an expectation of a future market price, and which did not happen. And this doesn't bring the stability for investors and for returns. So we need to find a way on how to fine tune that. And I start to see articles that there will be now a future carbon pricing that the government would guarantee, and that would bring this stability for people making investments, right? If you get your technology at a certain abatement cost, it makes sense to go invest. What I think is very critical is really to avoid a patchwork of regulations. So better to have less regulations, and because otherwise you start to have all of those interferences, right? For example, you have a carbon pricing, but you have renewables mandates and you have energy efficiency mandates. This will end up giving the wrong signal, because you have a lower demand for the carbon. So how do you balance all of that? I think those are some of the learnings that we need to have moving forward.
Así es. Gracias. Michael.
Well, I think in our world, we see the impact of this instability in pricing in the uncertainty of commitment to communities. If we're asking communities to make long-term change in their livelihoods to address deforestation, it's very difficult to convince them that we're serious, the world is serious about that, when we can't agree on a value that we place on protecting that forest by those communities. So this instability translates into challenges in convincing communities on the ground, working with them to help them move in that direction. I think we're seeing more stability now. I think the ETS was a great example, as has been mentioned. It's a regulatory, we never understood why a regulatory system would allow the price in the market to drop below a price that achieved the regulatory outcome. It's a regulatory system. You know what the minimum price is to achieve the regulatory outcome. Just make that the floor. Doesn't have to be a perfect market. So I think we always wondered why it took so long to fix that problem of supply and demand to get the price where it needed to be. But just to be aware that those prices do matter and the stability of pricing matters, and the long view of pricing matters when you're talking about what value we're placing on protecting forests.
I agree with the fact that we are before a great challenge, but we're also facing a great opportunity. For this reason, I celebrate these type of webinars. As far as we can get to know the good examples that we have in Latin America and in other regions, as far even not only that it's convinced by the authorities, but also we get to know some videos or some webinars. We get to know the experiences from communities that they have implemented it and see how they've changed their lives, how they have a dignifying life that allows them to solve some of their needs and they really enjoy what they're doing. So that's also going to be important for our countries to know directly first-hand experience from their perspective. We are at a very important moment because times of climate change have been accelerated, not only the increase of temperature and global change, but also President Biden had taken the measures that he has been taking and the ones that he has announced that has allowed in the European Union, in Asia, and in England so we say it in Panama, we're kind of rolling up our sleeves to work together because transformation times have been accelerated. That's good. It's good for our countries. It is important for us to be prepared, that we also need to roll up the sleeve and work together in transformations in our countries. And I'm totally convinced that the carbon market at national level, that they could also be articulated as a regional market. A regional market in Latin America could also be articulated very well with the European market, California market, or any other North American market, even with the Chinese market, or any other. They could be articulated. Panama is a very small country, but it's a country that's pretty interconnected. We have a service economy, a logistics economy service. We have transnationals from all the regions in the world that they reduce their emissions, but they would just record them in their headquarters in the countries. They compensate them in their countries. Today, at the present, with the new regulation we have and with the carbon emission program, they have to record and register here in Panama, and they would probably next year do that credit transaction in the market, in the Panamanian market. So I think that little by little our countries are advancing, and sessions like these are going to strengthen that cooperation so that we can continue and really we could achieve not only our national market but articulating a regional carbon market. I would like to thank organizers USAID, Ayete, Aso Carbono, and the government of Colombia. Thank you very much. I hope you're all keeping well.